Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders. Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people.
Hey there guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres.
And I'm Sage from Terra Nova Acres, and we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today we have Chrissie back on the podcast. She said last time she was here that she was going to come back and talk to us about bees. So if you haven't listened to her little introduction, get to know her episode, she was on here with us for episode 13. But this time we're going to be talking about bees. But before we actually get into the topic, Chrissie, why don't you tell us about your week?
My week was pretty eventful. So last time I was on the podcast, I was sort of having an existential crisis about, I think I had just quit my job, and was also considering moving to the other side of the country, which I don't think I talked about that, but I just bought a house with 5.5 acres, and it is a little log cabin, and I'm very excited to actually have a proper homestead. So stay tuned for more news about that. I think I'll probably start with chickens and pigs, and maybe goats to help clear my woods next to the house because half of it is wooded. But there are also grape trees on the property. They're not really trees, but they're just grapevines that are super old and are 20 feet tall, that are producing grapes right now. So that's very exciting.
Are they grapes or are they muscadines or both?
They are wine grapes, I believe. But I don't know. I think they're muscadine, but I don't know exactly what variety because I don't really know grapes. I've never gotten grapes because they take 7 years to grow. They're probably not that long, but I'm just guesstimating.
Right. Being a renter, you don't really invest in perennials.
You can't think about perennials, and I would like to think about fruit.
Yeah.
I would like to have fruit. So
you graduated from a renter, graduating from the backyard garden and the quail, and upgrading to 5
chickens.
acres.
Yeah, graduating from strawberries to grapes and from quail to chickens. So it's very exciting.
Big deal.
Are you keeping your quail?
No, I'm probably going to try and sell them. The only reason I was raising them, honestly, is just because they're small and quiet and they're easy in small spaces and they're pretty non-conspicuous. But for the number of eggs I eat, I only need 5 chickens. I don't really need 20 quail, But then meat chickens are going to be a whole other thing. So I say 5 chickens now, but we'll check back next time I'm on the podcast. It'll probably be many more chickens than that. So such as chicken math.
You need to acquire new skills so we can have you on to teach us more things.
I know. Maybe I'll get a dog like this one to help guard my property too. So Mickayla, how was your week?
I have been covered in drywall mud for the last 5 days straight, and I'm ready for it to be done. But it looks so nice. Even though it's not finished, it's already a little bit brighter in here because half the walls are white, and I'm sore. Every little part of me is sore. My fingers are sore, my feet are sore, my butt cheeks are sore, my neck is sore. Literally everything is sore. I wasn't expecting that. It's been a minute since I've done any physical activity because it's been too hot and I've been having breathing issues all summer, so I've been inside not really doing a whole lot. It feels good to be doing something, and I'm excited to finally have the drywall finished in our house because then I can have people over and not be like, hey, welcome to my construction zone. But I'm ready for the drywall process to be done. Taylor just started sanding that tonight, and we had to block off with a huge drop cloth tarp thing across the kitchen so we don't have dust all over our kitchen. And the cats love that. They're not. Buggy is terrified of plastic bags. So she's hunkered down in our room or in this room with me, and I hopefully she can make her way into the kitchen to get her food and water and isn't too terrified. So yeah, I've got 2 coats done on that. Need to do the 3rd one after Taylor sands and everything. And then I can move on to priming. And this is only half of the house. We're doing the kitchen later. I'm starting with the hallway and the living room. Really, the only thing that I've done this week as far as the garden and stuff goes is I picked a ton of marigolds, like all the different varieties, and some zinnias, and I made this like 9-foot long flower garland out of them, and I'm hoping that it stays nice and bright so that I can use it for like fall decor, but I have it hung in front of all my canning jars right now. And then I also was picking some zinnias to hang dry and try and use those as like centerpieces for Thanksgiving because I'm hoping to host some of our family who's coming down. Honestly, I'm just trying to get my house in order. There are so many things that I need to do this month with like finishing the drywall. We have our floors. We're going to try and get the floors and the new subfloors in the next few weeks because we have guests coming at the end of the month. And it's my best friend and her toddlers. And I don't want to have just subfloors with like nails sticking up with little kids being here for a week. So we're trying to get it as far as we can. And then I've been trying to plan out documentary footage, our 2-year anniversary video footage, and like filming that. And then we're going to be doing like a Christmas holiday special video that I'm trying to plan out because I want to film things before it's brown outside. Just, yeah, trying to get the camper ready. All the things. I've been painting in the camper. It's just absolute chaos right now. I've been trying to get the house cleaned up while also having drywall dust all over the place. I deep cleaned my laundry room right before we got on here tonight, so that felt nice. There were some pretty nasty eggs in there that I forgot about for quite a while. The most eventful part of my week was a couple days ago. I was getting ready, like getting all my drywall stuff around and about ready to start my drywalling process, and I looked over and my cat peed on all of my homegrown potatoes. So I have to go get rid of them. I just threw them out on the porch. I'm going to try and plant them and see if that will still work. It wasn't like a really long situation. It happened quickly, and I hope that they don't like rot. You know, I hope they'll still grow. So I'm not going to eat them, but I'm hoping that doesn't hinder their growth at all.
Maybe it's the perfect potato fertilizer and you guys are really onto something.
All I know is that growing up, my mom repeatedly tried to plant an apple tree in our yard, probably like 6 times, and every time one of our cats peed on it, and it just died. So I'm pretty sure that cat pee just kills plants. So I'm not too hopeful, but yeah, that was kind of a bummer.
I mean, when I first started my backyard garden, and my plants were very nutrient deficient, it's got nitrogen in it.
What's some other stuff?
It works.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think.
Ricky pees in our garden all the time, so I mean, things still grow. Hopefully it doesn't hinder it, but I'm going to try planting it. So I guess we'll see if anything comes of that. I'll have to update you guys. That was my whole week, just being covered in drywall mud. What were you up to this week, Sage?
More food preservation. And I know that sounds like surely you did something else this week. No, I've been just putting away food. And there are some holes in what I've been getting from the garden. Like my tomatoes are pretty much all dead now. And I just didn't have a great year because of the fungus. So I made a trip out to the farm store out by you, Mickayla, and picked up a couple bulk boxes of tomatoes. And then I also got some cucumbers while I was there. So the cucumbers will go to relish, the tomatoes will go into a few different things. I already forgot what I made with them. I made some tomato soup and tomato jam. That's what I did with the first part of the tomatoes, and the rest are ripening in the kitchen now. I got some deer apples that are not technically for human consumption, but I cooked them all. I'm not eating any of them raw. They're just the apples that are a little small. They're a little dinged up. They might have fallen onto the ground, and so for various reasons, the businesses or the orchards just can't sell them like they do their other apples, so they sell them as deer apples. But it's like $10 for a giant bag, and so I got 2 of those, put that up, put some more of the peaches up. I found some mushrooms, some chicken of the woods. It was on my road, and I'm not kidding. I like slammed on my brakes in the middle of the road when I saw them, and I whipped around. And I went back and I picked them as quickly as I could and hopped in my car and then got back out of the way. That was eventful. I pretty much chopped those up and froze them. And then I've also been trying to be diligent about harvesting herbs. It's close to fall, so like if I'm gonna pick them, now is the time. They've had all season to grow and they're about to get a little sad, get a little brown. So I'm trying to pick herbs, dry them, so that I can have some medicinal tinctures and things to mess around with when it gets cooler and I get bored.
Have you tried the valerian tincture that I gave you? Have you experimented with that?
No. Not yet. But it's sitting in my pantry for me to try whenever I need some help sleeping at some point.
Yeah, the problem with herbalism is once you make the tinctures, you have to try them, and
I
that
feel like,
it kind of scares me.
yeah, have you even tried it yet?
No,
Okay,
I
well,
ha-
wait until after you try
I
some
haven't
tincture.
had an evening where I'm like, okay, I'm blocking off my night. I'm taking the valerian tincture.
It helps you sleep. It helps you relax, but
Yeah, to
it
be
helps
clear.
you sleep so that people know what's going on there.
Some people say you have crazy dreams on it, so I don't know. We'll see.
That sounds like the last thing I need.
I
Not
haven't
today's topic,
tried
unfortunately.
the tincture that you gave me yet, Sage, but I want to let it sit for probably like at least another week, and then I'm gonna try it. I like opened it and I like showed it to Taylor, and I was like, Sage made me this, and he's like, what is it? And he smelled it. He's like, it just smells like alcohol. I was like, it's asthma moonshine.
Well, what is it?
It's a bunch of herbs, but it's a tincture, so they're sitting in alcohol.
Yeah.
It's asthma moonshine.
As they do.
There you go. All right, now let's move on to the actual topic today, which is talking all about bees. Chrissie is going to teach us the basics of beekeeping. And so can you explain to us a little bit about your background with beekeeping, any formal training that you've had, and then personal experience?
Yeah, so I took my first beekeeping class when I was a senior in high school. A lot of local beekeeping associations, usually at the county level, will have they have a club, and then they'll have classes over the winter for beginner beekeepers. Usually they're like 5 to 6 weeks, and you'll go once a week. They give you a textbook, and they'll teach you the basics of how to take care of bees, bee biology. And then in the spring, sometimes they have a field day where you can go out and you learn. So I think I just came across beekeeping on YouTube, and I got very enthralled by it because I didn't even know what beekeeping was before that, and so I was just very intrigued, and I think I binged like every single video and every single resource I could find on it, which seems like a common theme with those of us here. Yeah, and then the way I first got into it after my class, because my parents didn't want me to have bees at our house. We had like a very small backyard, and they didn't want me to do that. So I reached out to someone who was in the club, and I said, hey, do you know anyone who would be willing to let me work with them and basically help them with their hives? And so then I got paired with this guy, Jeff, and we together started 2 hives. We were both beginners. We started 2 hives on this old colonial farm, which was very fun, like back in the woods. And yeah, from there, I was just kind of working with Jeff and those bees. And then I went to college, and so I obviously didn't take those bees with me to college. But the summer after my sophomore year of college, I did an internship for a honey company, and my job was to be essentially a full-time beekeeper's assistant. So I followed around these 2 master beekeepers, and we were just working hives all day, harvesting honey, treating. We would also go to farmers markets and sell the honey. And so that was my really deep dive into beekeeping, where I feel like I kind of learned how to ride the bike, so to speak. And so it's one of those things where once you learn how to do it, you get the basics down, then you never forget, right? It's a pretty solid foundation. Since then, I've moved around a few times. I've always been a renter. And so I've been pretty transient. So I've started a lot of hives. I have not maintained a lot of hives. But that's how I got into it. So no formal like professional training, I would say. Although I did, after the podcast we filmed last time, I went and I worked as a beekeeper, actually full time, for 3 weeks. And I ended up leaving that job for reasons not really related to the bees. It was more so just the working environment didn't really fit with what I was looking for. So I did kind of try to do the full-time beekeeping thing. I think for me personally, that time in my life has maybe passed, or maybe we'll circle back to it. Right now, it just wasn't the time. I've taken a few different classes, some internships, some personal stuff. So really just all over the place.
So now that you have 5+ acres, are you going to get bees again to like have on your actual property?
You know, this is the question. I don't know. I think initially I might not do bees just because they, I think, are one of the highest maintenance livestock you can have. This is at least the way that I keep bees with Langstroth hives, and like we'll get into what that means and the different styles of beekeeping. I don't know. It's pretty difficult to keep bees through the winter time, at least in my experience, and I would rather focus on other livestock and setting up the garden and really like establishing my property, at least in this first year. So I still have all my equipment. I might sell it. I'm not really sure. I might just hang on to it for now. My bees this past year got killed, and then I don't really remember, did I have bees this year? I don't think I did bees this
No,
year.
you didn't have bees this year. You had bees last year.
Yeah, I had bees last year, but I had wax with honey in it that was stored in my basement, and you're not supposed to keep wax stored just out like that because wax moths can get into it. But I was having a lot of really good luck with no wax moths, and so I got kind of complacent with it. And then by the time I would say late July this year rolled around, I looked at my boxes of my beekeeping equipment. I said, there's honey seeping all over the floor. And then I kind of looked around the corner, and I like was up next to the box, and I heard just like little, little noises of little maggots just chewing things. And I was like, oh God. So yeah, that was fun to deal with. I thought about taking some pictures so you could show them as B-roll here because they're pretty horrific. But anyways, we can talk more about that in the pest section. So yeah, and that happened to me last year too with like storing my equipment. It's really difficult. Like again, beekeeping is a very high maintenance hobby. Like you need a lot of stuff to do it right. And yeah, so I might take a break for the next year.
All right, so how about like the basic beekeeping setup? What are some of the elemental tools of the trade?
Yeah. So the bee boxes that most people think of that are shaped like a cube and usually have a metal lid on the top, those are called Langstroth hives. And they were invented in the United States. The advantage of those hives essentially is that they have a box on the outside of just like a wooden frame that's hollow on the inside. And then inside there's 8 to 10 frames. So again, it's kind of like a picture frame. And then you would put a sheet of wax in the middle that the bees will then draw the comb off of. And the comb is hexagonal. So usually the foundation of wax is stamped with a hexagon pattern so that the bees can draw the comb out from that. And the frames go inside of the box and they're removable. In the United States, it's actually illegal to have hives that do not have movable frames because they're much more difficult to treat for pest and disease. I have my opinions on what is actually the most natural and healthy hive structure, which, I mean, we know in nature that bees live in logs and they live in highly insulated structures. And so, the advantage of these Langstroth hives is that they're easy to harvest the honey from. You just take the frame of honey, you brush the bees off, you put it in what's called an extractor, which is essentially a metal centrifuge, and you spin it, and the frames will spin around, and the honey will just fly out of them onto the sides and then drip down to where you can collect it out of a spout. That's the hive body is what we call it. So that's the Langstroth hive. And then there's an extractor to extract honey, which you can obviously also just take the honeycomb and crush it and get the honey out that way. And then a hive tool kind of looks like a tiny crowbar. So it usually has a hook on one end and then like a paint scraper, almost just like a flat, sharp side on the other end. I should have brought one to show. Actually, I have one in my car. I have some stuff in my car if we want to go get it. That is the tool that you use to manipulate the frames within the hive and just move things around, because the bees will propolize the hive, which means that they create this very hard, sticky substance called propolis and fill all of the cracks in the hive where air might be getting in that's causing a draft and can throw off their thermoregulation within the hive. And then they will also fill any space that is bigger than 3/8 of an inch with wax. So that space is called bee space. And the way that the Langstroth hive is designed, so again, it's the box with 10 frames all lined up next to each other inside. And in between each frame is 3/8 of an inch. And then in between the top of the frame and the top of the hive is also 3/8 of an inch. So the bees have just enough room to walk around inside the hive, but they won't fill it with wax. So sometimes you'll see if you just put a box out and bees colonized it and they built their colony and there and all their foundation and their honey and everything, then the pattern can actually be pretty irregular. So bees build their wax generally in kind of a teardrop shape, like a circular shape. They build it down and it's round, but they might build it kind of wavy. It won't necessarily be straight, but it can look cool. I know there's a lot of Asian honeybee keepers keep their bees like that. But what we have are primarily European honeybees. And then some of the other tools of the trade you will likely want to start with are some sort of protective equipment, whether it's a veil at the very least to protect your eyes and your nose from bees going in there and stinging your sensitive parts of your body, or it's a full jacket, or it's a full suit, so from head to toe covered so that the bees don't sting you. They can sometimes still sting through the suit or the jacket, but it's less likely. And then same with gloves. So some sort of leather glove is really good for protecting against bee stings. I generally prefer goat skin because it's softer and it's easier to move your hands around inside, even though it's still pretty thick. Some people use nitrile gloves if they want more sensitivity within the hive, because it can be hard to manipulate the frames and all the little things, and also not be squishing bees with your fingers if you have these big leather gloves. And then some beekeepers don't use gloves at all, so they have, maximum sensitivity with their fingertips, but they're also the most likely to get stung, although you might argue that they're actually less likely to get stung because they can feel where they are in the hive and that they're less likely to squish bees with their hands. Hive tool. Oh, and then smoker. So smoker is the last thing. That's a pretty basic piece of equipment. I would argue not necessary, but recommended, especially in certain parts of the year when the bees can be more aggressive. A smoker will help to calm down the bees, so to speak, by making them think that their house is on fire and that there's actually a wildfire going on. And so then the bees will freak out and go down into the comb and gorge themselves on honey. And then they become sort of soporific. They become kind of sleepy and less likely to sting you because they're pretty preoccupied with getting the honey out because they think that their home is about to melt. So I try not to use smoke as much as possible because I believe that it stresses out the bees, but it is helpful if you need to move a lot of them out of the way quickly.
Way better to have a smoker ready to go and not need it than vice versa.
Correct. And especially when there's a lot of bees flying around or a lot of bees covering the frames, sometimes it helps just to get the bees to move down into the frames so that when you're putting boxes back on top of each other after you've taken the hive apart, you've inspected, and then you're putting it all back together, you don't want to crush a bunch of bees, which can obviously also stress them out and send out stress pheromones, and then the bees are more likely to sting you. So it's kind of a thing to decide in the moment with what you're comfortable with and what you think the bees need.
You can also blow on them to make them move.
You can. They don't like carbon dioxide, so you can blow on them, but Yeah,
you get lightheaded.
it only works for like a few bees at a time.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that in the US there are like a specific kind of bees that are kind of really common, but what other kinds of bees are commonly kept and cultivated by beekeepers in general?
Sure. So usually the bees that are cultivated for honey are European honeybees. So honeybees are actually not native to the United States. There are small stingless bees that can be cultivated for honey that are native to the Americas generally and also Asia. They're really small. Their honey is pretty watery, and they have colonies that look more like a bumblebee colony would. So it's pretty different from what we would think of as a usual honeybee comb. But the European honeybees are what almost every beekeeper that you would buy honey from the store, that's what they are using. It's actually illegal in the US, again, to have Asian bees because they're not native here. So there are different strains or breeds of the European honeybee, which people have been breeding, kind of like breeding dogs or cats. They breed for different traits, different personality traits or aesthetic traits. You may have heard of Africanized bees. African honeybees are generally more aggressive, but they also produce a lot more honey, versus Carnolian bees, for example, which are much more beginner friendly. They're much more gentle, but they may not produce as much honey. Or Russian honeybees do really well in the cold weather, but again, they're also more aggressive. So there's different breeds. Some people also breed local strains. So if you're just getting into beekeeping, and you want your bees to be well adapted to your region, then you might seek out a beekeeper who has been breeding bees in that region for several generations of bees to make sure that they are well adapted genetically to your area and they're more resilient to the environmental conditions there. But yeah, generally the European honeybee is what you're going to find.
Is the European honeybee synonymous with Italian honeybees?
Yes, so it's Italians, Carnolians, Russians. These are all different types of the European honeybee. Hence, they're from different parts of Europe.
Okay, so
Not
you
Russia,
said
but
you said that the Asian honeybees aren't native here, so they're illegal to have here. Are the European ones like considered native here now?
Right. Well, so the European honeybees were introduced so long ago that I don't think the USDA existed then. So yeah, at this point, the European honeybees are basically everywhere. They're all over the world, because again, they're what people, for millennia have been cultivating to produce honey. They're cross borders, but the stingless bees are not in the US right now. I'm sure there are probably some beekeepers, again, under the radar who are keeping those, but I don't believe you're allowed to. I think it would be considered, again, some sort of invasive species since it's not native.
Probably getting a little ahead of ourselves, but now I'm just curious. Is that particularly because of the mites and things that they might bring with them?
That's a good question. So the Asian honeybees are co-adapted with the varroa mites. So they are the varroa mites are not a big pest for the Asian honeybees because they are smaller than European honeybees. And so they have a shorter brood cycle. So they spend less time as a larva kind of growing into a bee, from an egg to a bee, than a European honeybee would. And therefore, the varroa mite, which is a pest, it's kind of like a tick. It's like a tick for bees that's the size of a football would be on your dog, basically. And it sucks the blood out of them. It's pretty nasty. But they reproduce in the cells where the bee is growing from an egg to a larva to a bee. And so if the life cycle of when they're growing is longer, then the varroa mite has more time to reproduce inside of that cell. So because the Asian honeybees have a shorter growth cycle of, from egg to bee, then the varroa mites don't have as much of a chance to reproduce. They're less of a problem. Yeah, varroa mites are native to Asia as well, and those were introduced in, I want to say, about the 80s into the US, and have been a big problem since then. But again, we'll talk a little bit more about that.
As far as actually getting the bees, I know there are a few different options. I know you can get the packages of them, which I think, Sage, that's what you got earlier this year or last year. A nuke and just like catching a swarm. Can you explain the differences and the benefits of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So the most basic, I would say, or the most natural, is a swarm of bees. So a swarm of bees is where you just see a cluster of honeybees essentially hanging on a tree or something. So they swarm when they're looking for a new home. Either they've outgrown their space, or it's diseased, or for some reason they just decided that where they had their hive previously was unfit. You can catch a swarm by setting up a box, hanging it up in a tree, and some people say you can put, is it lemongrass essential oil, and it'll attract the bees there. But it's kind of a random process, sort of luck of the draw, if you're able to actually catch a swarm. If you want to go and purchase bees and not just catch them from the wild, then you can either purchase a package or a nucleus colony, or a nuke. So a package is a shoebox sized little mesh box full of bees. And it comes with a little can of syrup, so sugar water that the bees can drink from while they're in the box. But these packages are transported all over the country. The bees are usually in there for, I would say, up to 5 days at a time before they start to get pretty stressed and they can start dying off. But they can be shipped. They're really easy to move around. And so you would need to take that package and then install it into your own hive. So what you could do, and Sage has a video on this, we did this on her channel, you crack the lid and you pull the queen out. The queen is in her separate own cage with some attendants that are taking care of her. And you flip the box upside down and you shake it in. Or you can just open the box and set it inside the hide and wait for them to walk out. It'll usually take about a day or two. And so that's a package. Usually packages cost about $120 per package. Nowadays, that's what I've seen in our area. I would say about $100 probably for a package. So they're a little bit more affordable option, versus a nucleus colony is a 5-frame established colony. So it's a small colony. It has bees. It has 5 frames with brood, which are essentially baby bees, pollen, and honey. So it has everything the bees need to kickstart their colony and get you ahead of the season. So nukes will be more expensive. They will run you probably $175 to $200 per nuke. But it may be worth it if you're a new beekeeper and you want to make sure your bees are established. And sometimes nukes will also be treated with medication before you get them. So if that's something that you want taken care of before you get the bees, that might be something you can achieve with a nuke.
But the one thing with nukes is they are only compatible with the Langstroth. Like the frames and the size of the frames are meant to be just like put into your Langstroth hive, and because that's not what I have, that's not what I got. So that's the one note. And for 99% of people, that's not going to matter because they have the Langstroth hive anyway. But just know that if you have a different kind of hive structure, that those frames are probably not going to fit in your hive.
Yeah, which I think is a good segue into setting up a hive. So do you want to talk a little bit? I talked about the Langstroth. Do you want to talk about the kind of hive that you have?
Oh my god, we're going to interview me in this one too?
It's a conversation.
Yeah, so there's also a Lons Hive. That's what I have. And then more broadly, horizontal hive, which there are multiple, different kinds of horizontal hives. They come in different shapes and forms. Kenyan top bar is one of the main ones. And so it's a little odd. It's not something that's popular, at least not in the US. I don't know about Europe. I would imagine it's a little bit more popular there, but the idea behind the Lons Hive is that it just replicates how bees would prefer to build their hives a little more naturally. So the Langstroth hive is really built for the convenience of humans. It's engineered around cultivating, keeping a lot of bees, making the honey easy to extract and comfortable enough that the bees can do what they need to do. Whereas the top bar in general, the horizontal hive in general, and the Lons hives that I have are focused on being a little bit more comfortable to the bees, because just generally in what I do, I am okay with inconveniencing myself a little bit more to make my animals more comfortable. I rotate my sheep and my chickens around that pasture. I don't do that because it's more convenient for me. I do that because I personally think that my animals are happier for it. And so it's the same concept with bees for me.
And so the kind of hive that you have, the Lons Hive, it's one fixed long box
One
with
giant box.
with deep frames that are just removable from the top. So there's not boxes stacked on top of each other. It's just one big, almost looks like a coffin.
You could take it there.
But yeah.
Yeah, and there are dividers. You can change effectively the size of their hive. So with a Langstroth hive, you would stack more boxes or take them away to change the size of their hive, so that they have enough space or so that they don't have too much space, because either one can throw them off. With this one, because with the Lons Hive, because the box is a fixed size, you change that effective space by adding divider boards into it. Just for anybody who's curious.
Yep. And so for setting up your hive, whether you go with a Langstroth, which will be much more common to find that equipment. Every beekeeping store you go to will have Langstroth hives. In ancient times, people were keeping bees in skeps originally, and probably just holes in a cave wall before that. But a skep is just a basket essentially where people would put the bees inside. They build their comb, and then when they had to harvest, they would just destroy the hive, which again is why these kind of hives that don't have movable frames are, again, illegally in the US, but in other countries, there are beekeepers still keeping bees in skeps or in clay tubes is really common in like Africa or more arid regions. Lots of different ways to keep bees. In terms of where to actually put your hive, generally you'll want to find a sunny spot. I would say south facing. The idea is you want the hive to be warm and dry because it helps the bees keep pests away. So there's another pest. We talked a little bit about the wax moth. There's another pest called small hive beetle, which can proliferate if the conditions are wet and if the bees can't ventilate. And so you'll want to keep your hive up out of a valley, for example. You'll want to keep it kind of, let's say, on the side of a hill as opposed to just sitting in the bottom of a valley where it can get cold and moist. And generally, you want a water source nearby if possible, some forage nearby. Bees will forage for up to 5 miles, so they can fly pretty far. But the closer the better. If they can preserve their energy, then they would much rather go somewhere that's closer so that they can put that energy into collecting more resources or building more comb and just be healthier overall, as opposed to having to go really far for their forage. And then last thing is just access. As a beekeeper, it is really a pain when you have to lug heavy boxes full of honey, which can be up to 80 pounds, up and down a hill or up and down a rocky slope. You really want to try and avoid that and save your back. So if you can drive up to where your hives are, or at least access it on some relatively flat space, then that would be ideal.
Starting from scratch, like how much does it cost to set up a hive?
For one hive, starting with a package, and then if you're doing Langstroth and you've got let's say you do 2 deep boxes, so there's different sizes of boxes. There's deep, medium, and shallow. It's pretty much what it sounds like. The deep boxes are the biggest, the deepest. The medium boxes are a little bit shorter, and then the shallow boxes are even shorter. If you do 2 deep boxes on the bottom, which would be where the bees will build their brood nest, so that's where they'll raise their young, they'll store resources, etc. And then on top of the brood nest, you have your honey supers, where you would exclude the queen from those boxes using a queen excluder, which is just a metal grate, essentially. And then you can have as many boxes on top of that for how much honey you think you'll get. As a beginner, I would start with 2 medium or deep boxes on the bottom, and then 2 or 3 maybe medium or shallow honey supers on the top. You can run deeps on the top, but again, a deep box full of honey is about 80 pounds, so just be ready to lift that from above your head if you have to. Filling that with foundation, with frames, probably just that alone, not even considering the other equipment like the gear that you'll need, would be $400. And then if you buy, a smoker, a hive tool, and a jacket or a suit, I would say that'll run you another $100. So just getting into beekeeping, and my experience at least, I would say one hive is probably $500 with your gear and everything. And then you usually want to have at least 2 hives, because it's good to have, number one, a hive that you can share resources between. If one of your hive is low on brood or it's low on honey, then you can swap frames between the 2 hives. And it's also good when you're a beginner to have 2 different hives so that you can learn what is normal and what is not. So if you just have one hive, it's kind of hard to tell, are my bees doing okay? Should they be doing better? Is what I'm seeing normal? Because you don't have any other point of comparison. So getting into beekeeping can be pretty expensive. Let's say maybe $600, $800 just to kick it off. But the benefit is it's a big capital investment up front. But then once you have your boxes, once you buy your frames, you don't ever have to buy that again, unless for some reason your equipment gets destroyed. Let's say you didn't set up a bear fence, which is something you'll want in regions that have bears. We live here in Appalachia. There's black bears, and so you'll want to set up some sort of electric fence around your hives, which again can run you another $100 to a couple $100 depending on how extravagant you want to get with your electric fence. And so unless your equipment gets destroyed by a bear, or you get a really rare disease called American foul brood, where you would have to burn your equipment because it's actually so contagious, and the spores can live in the soil for decades and decades, you will have that equipment there on after. You can sell it, you can reuse it. Bigger expenditure up front. You can get used equipment off of Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, but you just want to be really careful about if the person before you had any sort of disease. So that's a big risk. And there's also beekeepers who build their own equipment. So if you're handy with tools and carpentry, then you can certainly build your own. I am not, so I just bought my own. I found a store that was going out of business, and most of their equipment was 50% off, and so I just got all my stuff from there.
How much was the Lons Hive? I don't remember. I know I looked at it when you sent it to me because we were planning on potentially building them.
I don't remember either. So
like
there are
500.
different kinds that you can get. I contemplated building mine, well, having Taylor help me significantly with building mine. And then it started to get to the busy season, and I was like, all right, how much is my time really worth? I want to say that it was $250, $300.
I thought it was going to
I
be
want to say it
like
was $300.
$700. delivered or something. Like, I remember it
Yeah,
was a
shipping was a
lot.
lot, which for two huge, because I got 2 hives because it was cheaper if I got both of them, and I knew that I would want multiple hives at some point, so I was like, I'm just gonna go for it. I got 2 hives, and then it costs a lot of money to ship 70-pound boxes, which fair. So yeah, it was about $700 to order both of those, have them shipped to me. And then my neighbors got a free, wonderful show watching me push them up the hill into the pasture. So, whatever that added value is.
I'm still salty you didn't film that for YouTube.
My ego couldn't handle it.
But you also convinced Taylor that now he needs to build those hives himself for us because he thought they were cool. And he was like, well, if she's not going to make me build them for her, I'm going to build them for us. So that'll happen at some point.
Yeah. I would say that one of the major reasons that my hive failed this year, there were a lot of things that went wrong. But one, I'm a new beekeeper. 2, I don't think I would have lost that hive if I had another hive to share resources with. The original queen that I got, her wings were messed up. She wasn't mated properly. She couldn't lay the eggs that she needed, but it took a really long time to figure that out. So, time that they didn't have.
Okay, so obviously throughout the year, you're kind of having to get into the hive to check on things, I assume. So how does that change throughout the year? What are you getting into the hive for?
Generally, the beekeeping season starts around March or April. So that's when the bees are starting to come out of their winter cluster, which they cluster for warmth and they kind of just hunker down for the deep winter months to stay warm. And they try to move as little as possible and just eat the stores that they have. So then around March, April, when spring starts coming around and it's warming up and things start blooming, the bees will begin going on their foraging flights. They'll begin to break their cluster and start moving throughout the hive and doing their normal activities. If you're just establishing hives for the first time in this season, then this is the time when you really want to be feeding your bees a lot. Different people have different opinions on this, but for, again, commercial, traditional, Langstroth beekeeping, I would recommend feeding either a 1-to-1 sugar water mix or a 2-to-1 sugar water mix. Different times of the year are better for 1-to-1 versus 2-to-1, but at the end of the day, you just want to make sure that your bees are getting enough sugar supplement so that they can build wax, because building wax takes a lot of energy. Your bees are going to be building up through these early months, they're going to be foraging a lot, they're going to be expanding their hive, they're going to be raising babies. And so if you are going to treat your bees, if you're going to medicate them against varroa mites, against other pests and diseases, you'll usually want to do one treatment in the spring around maybe May or June, and then you'll want to do another one in the summertime, potentially even a third. And so this is a time when once your colonies start building up a little bit, they start getting bigger, maybe you've added a second box on top, you'll want to treat them. You can usually do a preliminary test for varroa mites by doing either a sugar roll or an alcohol wash. So with the sugar roll, you will take a cup of bees, literally, like take a measuring cup. So you'll shake some bees onto into like a bucket or something, and then take a scoop and then put 1 cup of bees into a jar with powdered sugar, and you roll them around. And then the idea is that the powdered sugar will cause the varroa mites that are on the bees to dislodge and fall to the bottom, and then you shake out the mites and let the bees fly away. So obviously the bees are a little bit shaken up, but at least they're alive and they look like little ghost bees, which is very cute. So then you can count how many mites were on there, and you do the math for, okay, 1 mite to however many bees are in a cup, which I think some people say is like 3,000 bees or something crazy, which like I don't really believe that, but or maybe it's 300 bees. 300 bees in a cup. Okay, yeah. Well, people say there's 30,000 bees in a package, which I also don't believe. But anyways, So you'll do your ratio, and then usually there's thresholds for, okay, so if I do my test and I find that there's more than 3% of varroa mite infestation, then you'll want to do a treatment. There's also different treatment options. I won't get into the details of that there. There's chemical, there's organic, there's all sorts of things. So you do some sort of treatment. Then in July, August, it starts to become harvesting season for honey, but it's also a time when it's a little bit drier, and so there's not as much forage for the bees. There's not as many flowers blooming in July, August, and the bees will be in a more aggressive state. They have a tendency to rob each other. So if you have multiple hives in the same yard and you have them open, or you have one hive open, then bees from other hives might come and try to rob that hive, and they can start fighting. This is a time when, as a beekeeper, we're also trying to supplement with feed if we can, sometimes with pollen patties, but generally just making sure that the bees have all enough resources and equalizing the hives again, so making sure they all have the same amount of resources, so that they're not fighting and killing each other and robbing. Harvesting honey, you'll want to do maybe another treatment, and then it starts getting into the fall. The bees are going to be starting to wind down their activities. They're going to be foraging less. They're going to start kicking out the boys. So there's three types of bees in a hive. There's the queen, there's worker bees, which are all female, and then there's drones, which are the male bees. They don't have stingers, and their only job in life is to mate with a queen, after which they die. Because they don't clean or collect resources or do anything else productive inside the hive, when it starts getting cold outside, the worker bees will throw the drones out to die in the cold, which is pretty brutal.
They don't do anything useful. It is rational.
Sure, yeah, you said it, not me. So they'll throw the drones out, and they'll start to basically pare down their population to just the bees that will be clustering over the winter and trying to stay warm. And then the cycle repeats. So our job is, throughout the year, is to make sure that the bees have enough resources going into winter, so that they have enough honey, they can stay warm, and that they will survive through the winter and not run out of honey or pollen or anything. And then the cycle begins again.
So what do you normally do to winterize a Langstroth hive to give the bees the best chance of staying warm and surviving winter?
Yeah, so the biggest killer for bees in the winter is actually not the cold, it's the wet, which is kind of similar to other livestock too. They can be cold or wet, but not cold and wet, right? Number one is you want to make sure they have good ventilation. But number two, you also want to make sure they're retaining heat. So those two things can be kind of tricky to do in tandem. So some people, especially in more northern regions, like in Canada, will wrap their hives in different materials. You can use felt, you can use there's specific like blankets that are made for hives that you wrap around, and they kind of velcro, and they strap shut for the winter time. So that gives the bees more insulation, so that they don't have to work as hard to insulate using their own body heat. It's also, again, really important to make sure they have enough feed, because that is what they're using to keep warm, is just their body heat that's radiating. So if they have enough honey that is within close access of where the cluster is, then they should be okay. And again, as long as the evaporation from them breathing and fanning their wings and everything can escape. So some people also do what's called a quilt box, where you take an empty box and put some sort of fabric on the bottom of it, and you kind of staple it to the box, and then you fill the top with wood shavings, and you put that on top of the hive, so that it kind of, again, it mimics them being in a tree, for example, where there's wooden insulation on the top, but then it also is absorbing the moisture that's coming through the hive. And so the bees are not wet, and there's not water collecting on the top of the hive, condensing, and then dripping down onto them, because that's really what can kill them. And then the other method I've seen is some people use what's called Reflectix, which is this like silvery bubble wrap kind of, it's an artificial material, obviously. They use it in like building, for insulating houses and stuff. We can take a sheet of Reflectix, put it on top of the box, and then put the cover on top of that. And I've heard people have really good reviews about it. A lot of beekeepers in our area use it. They say that the condensation will just go to the edge of the Reflectix and then drip down, so it's not actually dripping onto the bees ever. I haven't tried it. I've tried a quilt box. I feel like it helped. I also wrapped my hives last year because I was just really desperate to get them through the winter. But they had other problems, other reasons why they didn't survive. Different ways to winterize, but generally throughout most of the United States in our climate, it's pretty mild. You shouldn't really need to winterize unless you get a bunch of snow. It's more of a supplementary thing. It's not necessary. If you have healthy bees going into the winter, you probably don't need to insulate your hives, but it is never going to hurt them.
Earlier we talked about the different kinds of like acquiring bees, the different ways, and one of them was the swarm. At what point in the year does that usually happen? Is it in the spring?
Yeah, so it's usually in the spring, when, again, the bees are emerging from the winter, they're starting to build up their population, and this is when bees are actually most prone to swarming. I have had bees swarm in the fall also, and they can swarm at any time, really, if they run out of space or, again, if their home becomes just not suitable. But generally, when they're rapidly building up their population in the spring is when the bees are very likely to say, uh-oh, we've run out of space. And then half of the population will just fly away with the queen. And then the remaining half of the population, in theory, will make a new queen. And the bees split their population kind of like a cell. Like a human cell will split in two, and that's how our cells divide and multiply. That's basically how a honeybee colony will also divide and multiply. So I would say around probably April, early May is when you're going to see a lot of swarming risk. And so you really want to stay on top of that at that time of year to make sure your bees have enough space and that they don't run out.
All right. And then my other question was, you said supplementing with feeding them sugar water. Why sugar water? Why not honey? Why not something else?
Yeah, you can totally feed them honey. That's actually much healthier for them. Honey has a lot of other nutrients and, beneficial enzymes that the bees will certainly prefer. But sugar water is just the most accessible. You can buy just regular white granulated sugar in big 40-pound bags from Walmart or from Costco or wherever. And you can just mix it. So sugar and water, at least the granulated sugar, are 1-to-1 by weight and volume. So it doesn't matter if you mix it 1-to-1 by weight or 1-to-1 by volume, it'll be the same ratio. So that just makes it easy. I think it just probably arose out of the need for commercial beekeepers to have an easy, accessible feed that can also be stored. So you can store sugar dry. I carry a bag of sugar in my car at all times, just in case. And so, but yeah, if you have honey on hand, that is better to feed them.
But significantly more expensive.
Very expensive, yeah. That's a big driver.
All right, now let's talk a little bit about bee biology. Can you teach us a little bit about the life cycle of a bee and the overall hive relationship?
Yeah, sure. So bees start out as an egg. So an egg is laid in the bottom of the cell, then they become a larva, and then they pupate and they become a bee. And for a worker bee, I want to say it takes about 16, no, that might be wrong. 2 to 3 weeks for a honeybee to hatch or emerge. And throughout the life of the bees, they have different jobs. And so when they first hatch, they actually can't fly yet. And so they come out of their cell, and their first job is to clean up their room. So they go and they clean the cell where they just emerged from, and they prepare it for a new egg to be laid there. And then they become what's called nurse bees. And so it's their job then to take care of the other baby bees in the nursery or the brood chamber. So it's their job to make bee bread, which is just a mixture of honey and pollen to feed it to the baby bees to make sure they're getting water and just generally take care of the babies. Then when they get a little bit older, there's different jobs that they can take on, such as cleaning the hive. Different fecal matter and other waste can gather in the hive that they need to expel. There's the undertaker, whose job it is to drag out dead bodies from the hive and throw them out the entrance. There are the queen's attendants, which are a court of probably 5 or 6 bees that their entire job is to follow the queen around and just be feeding her and give her food and water so that she can focus on just laying eggs and she doesn't have to do anything for herself. Then there's also, once they get a little bit older and then they can start to fly, they're a little bit more mobile. They can become a guard bee. So a guard bee will usually be hovering around the entrance or just hovering around the hive and being on guard looking for any threats to the hive. These are the bees that will usually sting you if you try and go into the hive. And then finally, when they are the oldest, they become foragers. So this is usually the last stage of life for the worker bees. And a forager bee in the peak summertime usually will live maybe 6 weeks. So they live a relatively short time. But then in the wintertime, they live much longer because they're just kind of huddling for warmth. They're not expending a lot of energy. And so they will go, they forage for flowers. They have a really sophisticated way of communicating to each other where the flowers are. So one bee, they don't see in color vision. I believe they see in UV light. So they can actually see which of the flowers contain more nectar because it will be brighter to them if it has more nectar. So the forager bees live about 6 weeks. In the wintertime, they live longer. And so once they become a forager bee, they see in UV light. So they will go and they can see which flowers are more illuminated and have more nectar in them. They'll go to the flower, they'll harvest the nectar and the pollen. They carry the pollen in kind of electrostatically charged hairs on the back of their legs called the pollen basket. So if you ever see a bumblebee flying around with like little yellow pollen on the back of its legs, it's carrying it in its little basket. And so they come back to the hive, and the hive internally is completely dark, right? There's no light that enters the hive except from the very front. And so near the entrance of the hive, there's a section of the comb that is called the dance floor. And so the bees will come back. The bees at the entrance will like check them to make sure that they're good, and then they'll come in. And the bee will go to the dance floor and it'll say, okay, guys, check this out. And it's dark in there, right? So the bees can't see any of this going on. But they'll do what's called a waggle dance to communicate where the flower is in relation to the sun and the hive. So they take like the angle and the distance, and it's dependent on when they're dancing, they go in a figure 8 shape, and they also wiggle their butts while they're doing it. And so depending on how many turns they do, and also how long the waggle is in between the figure 8, communicates the distance and the angle of the flower from the hive in relation to the sun, which is insane because they also can't see the sun when they're in the hive. So it's pretty crazy. And because the bees can't see in the hive, they have to feel this all through vibrations. So all the bees that are standing around that one bee that's dancing are just like blindly trying to feel this dance going on. And then they say, okay, I think I got the coordinates. And then they will go and harvest from those flowers.
I would be the worst bee.
We are an inferior species.
Well, we're also inferior because bees have a true democracy, so they have a popular vote. They don't have an electoral college or anything like that. For example, when they are looking for a new place to live, so we talked about when bees outgrow their hive, they will swarm and they'll go hang on a tree branch and look for a new home. The way that they find that new home is that scout bees will go and they will go try and find a hole in the log or whatever they think is a suitable new home. They will come back to the swarm, they will dance and tell the coordinates of that new home, and then the other bees will go check it out. If they also like it, they'll come back, they'll dance. And so once a majority, like literally over 50% of bees are waggling in favor of that one location, the bees will all go. And then the last thing, of course, is that bees have a matriarchy, which is interesting. The queen has a lot of really fascinating reproductive abilities. A virgin queen, after she's just hatched, will, once she is old enough to fly, she'll go on her mating flight, and she'll usually mate with 5 or 6 bees from all different hives in the area. She will store the sperm inside of her for the rest of her life and pull on that to create a genetically diverse offspring of her own. And she can also choose whether that offspring that she lays is going to be fertilized or not. And so fertilized eggs are worker bees, female, and then unfertilized eggs are drones or male. So she kind of has this like switch inside her body that she can choose to fertilize the egg or not. And then once the drones mate with the queen, their literally falls off and their guts just like pull out of their body and they fall from the sky, and it's a kamikaze mission. So their one job is to, like I said earlier, to mate with a queen and then literally die. That is it. So all the drones, all the male bees that you actually see out and about have failed their life mission to mate with a queen. So maybe, they're getting thrown out of the hive anyways. Yeah, bees are really fascinating. They're very smart.
Violent.
All I'm going to say is that's poetic, and I'm going to shut up after that.
Are there other things that they communicate, like threats and, you said wildfires, that kind of stuff earlier? Do they do their little dance for those things too?
So they communicate a lot through pheromones, and that can be either stress signals or it can be pheromones that tie the hive together. So a hive knows when it's queenless because there won't be the queen's pheromones or these kind of chemical signatures floating around the hive. And the way actually that bees know that their hive is getting too big and that they need to split and swarm is when bees in one area of the hive can't sense the pheromones of the queen in another section of the hive. So when the queen's pheromones get so far away or so faint that they can't really smell her anymore, then they'll split. So that means the colony is too big to keep the whole thing together, which I learned that recently and thought it was really interesting. Yeah, that's a good question though. I'm sure with other threats and, actual animal predators and stuff, they do have more communication methods, but there's a really good book about there's a lot of really good books about bee biology, but one about like their voting structure and communication is, I think it's called literally Bee Democracy or something like that. So look it up. It's a really good book with a lot of scientific studies to back this all up.
In the beekeeping community, we hear a lot about challenges facing hives like colony collapse, the varroa mite that we talked a little bit about earlier. Can you explain some of the most common issues and how to hopefully prevent them, but if not, manage them?
Sure. So circling back to the varroa mites, they are probably the biggest problem facing honeybees right now. Just because, again, they're not native to European honeybees, and so they're pretty fragile when it comes to their natural defenses against them. So things that we can do to help the bees fight off the varroa mites is to generally keep them healthy and prevent things that can lead to colony collapse disorders, such as use of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, loss of forage or loss of habitat, making sure the bees have access to water, making sure they are not being prone to other pests and diseases like small hive beetles, viral infections, making sure the bees have good genetics and, again, are adapted to your region, and that we're also breeding for bees that are varroa resistant. So there are some strains of bees that are called varroa hygienic, which means that the bees, generally the way that they deal with varroa on their own is one bee will go and pull the mite off of the back of another bee and they'll try and throw it out of the hive. It's difficult for them to do that with all of the mites. And so some beekeepers are, and actually scientists are working on breeding strains of honeybees that are more hygienic or are more likely to pick the bees off of each other, or sorry, pick the mites off of each other and get the mites out. Or they will also be more likely to go into a cell with a larva that has already been infected with varroa mites and throw that larva out. So they basically abort that baby bee. It's a big challenge. There are medications that you can give to bees to treat for varroa mites and to kill them. So it's essentially insecticides that are such a low dose that it will disrupt the neurological function of the varroa mites, but not of the honeybees. The problem with that is that over time, similar to antibiotics in humans, the varroa mites will evolve a resistance to it because the ones that survive the insecticide will then reproduce, and you'll have to give your bees a bigger and bigger dose of medication. This is such a recent pest, in the long history of beekeeping, the past 40 years, we've really been dealing with varroa mites in the United States. There is no cure for it at this point. There's a big debate in the community on whether to treat or not to treat. Most commercial beekeepers do treat their bees because if you don't treat your bees, it's pretty guaranteed at this point that you will lose your hives. If not in the first or second year, you will in the third. And also, if you let varroa mites multiply within your own hives, and then your bees go and interact with bees from some other hive because they're flying around, they're foraging the same flowers, then you can spread varroa mites or other pests really to other beekeepers, even if they're far away. Most people, I think, feel that it's generally being a good steward of your livestock to treat them. Again, if you saw your dog with a tick on its back the size of a football, would you just leave it there? I think most people would want to take care of it. The other side of that is on the resistance. They say, well, medication is not a sustainable path because then we're just creating more resistant mites. So we should let natural selection take its course and breed bees that are living alongside these varroa mites, and over generations and generations, the bees will co-adapt to live with the varroa, and it won't be as much of an issue. There's different schools of thought there. I think we even have different schools of thought on this. I'm more on the traditional commercial side. I think you're more on the natural beekeeping side of things. And there's definitely pros and cons to both, but it's a very personal decision on what you choose to do with your bees.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say that I fall definitively or entirely on one side or the other.
Yeah.
There's a trigger point to me in the same way that I have my deworming solution ready for my sheep to use it when I need to use it, but I'm not gonna do it on a schedule just because it's kind of the same deal where it creates more resistant bugs. So I think there's cases where it makes sense and it's the responsible and ethical thing to do, and I think there's the flip side to that where it's overdone.
Yeah, again, it's like antibiotics. Would you take them proactively to prevent a bacterial infection, or would you take them only once you have the bacterial infection? So there's different sides of that coin. But yeah, so really, I mean, these are the biggest issues affecting honeybees right now. Generally, though, I would say that the bees that are most in trouble when we talk about save the bees and that sort of thing are the native pollinators. So honeybees are actually very opportunistic foragers. They can forage from a lot of different plants, and they tend to outcompete native bees, which tend to be more specialized. So maybe, your small, blue, shiny native bee can only forage from one particular plant or two particular plants. And if the honeybees are then going and taking all the nectar and pollen from those plants, then there's no food left for those native bees. And so those sensitive species can be outcompeted and go extinct actually due to overpopulation of honeybees. The reason why Save the Bees has become such a big thing is because in our agricultural system today, it tends to be large, thousands and thousands of acres of a single crop, let's say corn or soy, which is usually what's in our country, but specialty crops that need to be pollinated, like almonds, blueberries, anything, or apples, anything that has a bloom, that people are not going to go in by hand and pollinate, which, some countries actually have had to start to do that now because of the issues they've had with their honeybees. Because we have these big swaths of monocrop agriculture and we've wiped out all of the native pollinators in that area because there's no biodiversity, now we have to bring in truckloads and truckloads of like 18-wheeler truckloads of bees, and hives to put throughout the apple orchard or the almond orchard or whatever it is, to pollinate those crops, because otherwise they won't get pollinated and then we can't eat it. So I think about 30% of our crops in the United States are pollinated by bees, whether they're honeybees or by native bees, just pollinated in general. There's also other types of pollinators like hummingbirds, moths, wasps. There's a lot of different kinds of pollinators that are not just bees, and they're all critical to the ecosystem. But yeah, so I think the reason why it's become so popularized nowadays is because it really affects commercial agriculture. And now that we're so dependent on honeybees, then if the honeybee populations collapse, then we will lose a lot of our food supply of, again, these specialty crops in the US. So a lot of your vegetables, a lot of your fruit are really things that we depend on honeybees for. But if we have a more biodiverse agricultural system and likewise a more biodiverse environment, we can build resilience against that in our food system.
I will say I did have a little bit of guilt getting honeybees because I have so many native bees that show up in my garden, and a lot of pollinators evolved alongside these plants to pollinate them, right? That's a special symbiotic relationship that they have. And so that's definitely something that I struggled with and continue to struggle with coming to terms of how responsible is it, because keeping honeybees is not saving the bees. Keeping honeybees is kind of the opposite, but also we're at a point now where we need them too. It's challenging for me.
It's a personal, and there's kind of a thresholds maybe point where it tips for different people. Yeah, saving the bees generally and pollinators generally is really critical to our food system, to our ecosystem, to everything in the natural world. But yeah, the focus on honeybees is certainly overstated, at least for backyard beekeepers. Backyard beekeeping has helped bring the population of honeybees back, and also just this becoming popularized has helped people cut down on pesticide use and other things that can harm bees and just the environment in general. Yeah, I mean, if you aren't getting enough pollination of your crops from your native bees, maybe it would help to have some honeybees to support that. And also, if you want to harvest honey, then that's the only way to do it, or to harvest wax. So they're a livestock like anything else. If you manage it responsibly, then hopefully they can find a balance within your natural ecosystem.
I was going to say, we talked about that last time you were on a little bit, how I also feel kind of guilty about wanting to get bees because we have fields around us that are all within either across the street or they're like a half mile down the road from us that I know they spray all of their fields for their animals for like hay and stuff. And our property was abandoned and it's just 8 acres of wild, mostly invasive plants, but it's still just like a sanctuary of untouched land that we have so many native bees. Like, they are everywhere. It's hard to walk in the spring when all of the like little violets and stuff come out into the yard because I don't want to step on them because the whole yard's just like buzzing and like moving with bees. And so I'm like, I feel guilty like about getting bees eventually because I don't want to hinder that. But I'm like, okay, well, maybe I just need to plant more flowers. Plant more things. And that will help.
Totally. And planting more forage can definitely offset that and be a solution. And planting flowers or forage that is different than what is already growing natively. So something that maybe the honeybees would be more inclined to go towards, as opposed to the little violets or flowers that are more difficult for honeybees to access, because there's certain flowers that, just based on the structure of the flower, it's easier for honeybees or most pollinators in general to go in. But let's say like a really tiny flower, with really tiny openings to go get the nectar, a honeybee may not be as inclined to go for that, but a small native bee, which, like you said, is co-evolved with that plant, would be, more specialized to go get that particular flower. So I think that's a great idea of how to offset that.
Yeah, I mean, we have butterflies and bees and all of the things. Just my whole garden right now is given to the pollinators because I haven't touched it in weeks. So I'm just like,
That's
okay,
right. My
yep.
pile of laundry is sitting in the corner for the
Yep.
pollinators.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we got, Sage came over this weekend and she's like, oh, you have monarchs. And I was like, there are so many butterflies out here every day. I didn't even like realize that until you pointed it out.
That's cool.
When we think bees, we think honey. Those two have kind of become basically inextricably linked. So we have to talk a little bit about honey. First off, how do bees make honey?
Yeah, so honey is essentially nectar that has been digested by the bees and then puked back up into the honeycomb. And so it has enzymes and it has all sorts of things that are really good for all living creatures, really. Honey is antibacterial. It's really good for you. The bees fan it with their wings to evaporate the water content. I want to say down below at least 10%, if not like 7% water content, at which point, once enough water is evaporated that it is shelf stable, the bees will cover the honeycomb with another layer of wax and they'll cap it off. So those are called cappings of wax. And so if you ever buy honeycomb at the store in those little boxes, you'll see that the wax is capped on the top. So that's what honey is. It's pretty straightforward. It's just the nectar from flowers. And the way that you know what kind of honey it is generally beekeepers will try and target a single bloom that is really prominent. So it's really difficult to say 100%, this is only clover or this is only goldenrod, because bees are going to forage all over the place. You can't control where they go with a fence. But what you can do is you can either take them to an area which has just a lot of that one thing, or you can take them to that area that has a lot of that one thing at a time when not much else is blooming. And so it's highly likely that the honey that they're collecting is mostly from that one thing. You can also tell from the color of the honey what plant it's come from. Different honeys will have different colors based on just the type of nectar. And if you really want to prove it, the only way to 100% prove it is to look at the pollen that is inside the honey. So you can extract the pollen grains and look under a microscope and say, okay, this is goldenrod pollen that is in this honey. And so I know for a fact that this, at least partially, came from a goldenrod plant. Now, in modern times, there is a big problem with counterfeit honey, particularly coming from overseas. And what they do is kind of similar to milk. They will ultra pasteurize, ultra filter the honey to, first of all, they kill off a lot of the good enzymes and a lot of the good things that are in the honey that are good for your health. But also, they remove all of the pollen grains and any trace of the original origin of the honey. And so what it's reduced to is basically just syrup. It's just sugar water. And they ship it all over the world. And the country of origin is usually just where it's bottled, but you have no idea where it actually came from originally. And it might just be sugar water. It might not actually even be honey. So there's a lot of information online about this if you guys are curious to learn more, but it's a big, big problem of counterfeit honey and people saying that honey is local when it's not, and honey is organic when it's not, and like it's really difficult to prove. If you want to make sure you're buying local honey, I would get to know your beekeeper, get to know your farmer, right? Like we always say, really go and know who you're getting your honey from. If you're buying it from the grocery store, it may not be actually local honey. If it's a big chain brand or commercial brand, something to watch out for. But because, yeah, again, the only way you can really know is from the pollen grains. Watch out for those counterfeits.
I have heard that getting honey locally, if not from your own bees, is like the best way to go about it in general, because I'm probably going to botch this, but because all of the like pollen and the good things that are in it are like directly related to your environment because it's from your area, so it can help you with like allergies and stuff because it's giving you those specific pollens. And I know some people take like the propolis as like a supplement. Is that a thing, or am I crazy?
Yeah, to be honest, I have not read up on the scientific backing of this. I know it's a very common thing that local pollen can help with local allergies. Personally, I do believe there's probably some truth in that. And then, yes, you're right. Propolis is also very good for you. It has been used historically, especially in Eastern Europe. It's very popular for boosting your immune system. Royal jelly also, which is the liquid that a baby queen bee will grow up in as a larva. It's the liquid that it contains enzymes and different proteins that actually turn her into a queen bee as opposed to a worker bee. That can also be extracted from the hive and is used in a lot of like skincare products and is really good for you. So a lot of things that come from the hive are good for your health. So yes, I would say that local honey is probably your best bet, and it definitely won't hurt to try for the allergies.
So, honey is a product that the bees make for their hive to consume and sustain themselves as a resource. What is your take on the ethics, or how ethical or unethical it may be to harvest honey from bees? And if there's a line there, if there's a way to do it ethically, if there's a way to do it maybe not so much.
Yeah, I would say my personal view is that if the bees create it, then they probably need it. I don't know if there is a completely ethical way to harvest honey without then needing to supplement the bees or needing to make up for that later on. However, there are more and less ethical ways to do it, right? So if generally a rule of thumb is you want to leave at least one box or one super of honey that the bees have created for themselves, in addition to the honey that's stored in their brood chamber, for them to eat off of over the winter. Some people will take all of the boxes of honey and then feed their bees sugar patties over the winter. So again, sugar is cheaper to feed the bees than it is to feed them honey, but it's also less nutritious. So it's a trade-off. People have been, again, harvesting honey from bees for thousands and thousands of years. It's one of the most ancient forms of agriculture. I think there are ways to do it where it's sustainable to some degree, but it's certainly something to be mindful of. And again, a very personal decision of where do you draw that line? How much honey do you harvest? So no good answer there, unfortunately.
So with that being said, how much honey do you usually get from one hive?
So again, with everything in beekeeping, it depends. If you ask 5 beekeepers the same question, you'll get 10 different answers. Personally, I actually have not harvested honey from any of my own hives just because, like I said earlier, I've started a lot of hives, but because I've been so transient over the past several years, I haven't had a chance to overwinter hives and then harvest. So generally, you don't want to harvest from hives in their first year because you just want to make sure that they get through the winter, they have as many resources as they need, and they're just set up really well to be a strong colony going through the winter and then coming out into the spring. So once you start harvesting in year 2, you can get a lot of honey from your hive. I mean, again, one deep box of honey can weigh 80 pounds. Of course, that's not 80 pounds of honey. That includes some of the wooden equipment, that includes the wax. But I mean, from one deep box, you could get probably half a gallon of honey at least. I mean, you can get a lot of honey. So people usually fill like several 5-gallon buckets from just a few hives. But it really depends, again, on how healthy are your bees, what is the forage like? Did they start with drawn out comb, or did they have to build all their comb that year? But
How many times a year do you harvest?
So usually in, I would say, the early summer, after their big population buildup in the spring. And again, that's if you've already had a hive through its first year and you're coming into your second year now. You can harvest in like late spring, early summer, and then another harvest in late summer, early fall. So usually the bigger honey harvest is in the fall. And that's when you're making the colonies smaller anyways, so that they can go into the winter and not have to heat up as much space. But there's some people who, and again, this is before the days of varroa mite, who in their backyard have been able to stack 10 boxes of honey supers on top of one hive, and just crazy stuff. Yeah. Again, before the times of pesticides and varroa mites and all these other challenges the bees have been facing.
I'm trying to think how much mead I can make with that much honey. We just made so much mead earlier this year, and it's delicious, and I want to make more.
So what about if someone isn't interested in keeping bees, but still wants to, help the pollinators, help the populations in whatever way they can? What are a few things that they can do?
Yeah, so a lot of things that we've talked about already. I would recommend mitigating your pesticide and herbicide and fungicide use if you can, even if it's an herbicide that, again, it's not an insecticide specifically. It can still affect the bees and their immune system. If they're going and foraging from those plants that you've sprayed with an herbicide, then it can still affect them. So stay away from those things, those chemicals as much as possible. If you can plant native flowers, that can help a little bit the population of the bees. And really just maintaining their habitat, I think, is the biggest thing. If you can maintain natural spaces with forage for them. So, for example, if you turn a lawn into a pollinator meadow that has a few feet of plants that they can shelter in, they can forage in, that's really going to help the native bees and their populations. And then just continuing to learn about these things, continuing to educate other folks about bees and how, yes, they can sting you, but they're actually pretty docile unless they feel threatened, kind of like, snakes or bears or anything. I mean, they don't want to attack you. They only will if they have to. And honeybees actually die after they sting because, kind of similar to the reproduction of how the bees mate, the stinger gets pulled out of the bee's body and it gets stuck in your skin, and so it pulls out their guts and they will die after they sting you. So it has to be a pretty big deal for a honeybee to sting you. Now, wasps and yellow jackets and hornets, they have stingers without barbs. So the honeybees have stingers with barbs, that's why they get stuck in your skin. Other stinging insects don't always have barbs. They have smooth stingers, and so they can sting you multiple times. It won't kill them. So they are definitely more of a nuisance, but they're still very important for the ecosystem. We talked about in previous podcasts how there's some parasitic wasps, for example, that will take care of pests on tomatoes and other garden plants. So all important for the ecosystem. So yeah, doing what you can to help out the little bees.
They really like white clover.
Yes, they love
I really
clover.
love clover. Yeah, so I try to keep clover in my pasture for multiple reasons, but
yeah,
that
white clover, red clover. They really like black-eyed Susans. What are some other common flowers that they like?
I always see them all over my poppies. I think they like echinacea. I've seen more native bees on my echinacea, but also hairy vetch in the spring. They love that one.
They like coneflower a lot. Green coneflower, purple coneflower. So yeah, there's a lot of seed packets you can buy at Lowe's or any of your big box stores that will be like a wildflower mix. So again, it's become pretty popularized nowadays through these pollinator meadows. So if you just throw down a seed packet, water it, and hopefully some flowers will grow for you and the bees.
Well, thank you, Chrissie, for coming back on. We're going to have you on again once you master some other form of homestead topic, and you can teach us all about whatever that is next.
Yeah, absolutely. And would love to have you guys out for a hive tour, or we can do some live podcasting from the hive, sweet sound of the bees. So yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
I'm definitely going to have you and Sage come over when we get our hive, and you're going to help us set it up, because I am still slightly terrified of it.
It's always scary the first time you take a box full of stinging flying insects and you're vigorously shaking it into another box.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.